Hey, this is JC, and today I'm going to show you a simple parallax offset within Redshift. I'm inspired by the game development community because what we render in minutes and minutes takes them a fraction of a second. I was on 80 level looking at this interview with Ali Youssef about how to build this cool cracked ice material inside of Unreal, and they have this really cool depth technique inside of this shader. And I figured I could recreate that in Cinema. I was having a ton of trouble until I found Alisavakis' technique on the same effect, but in Unity. I'm making this tutorial because both of those breakdowns use techniques that we can't really use inside of Redshift right now. Unreal allows you to pipe in different coordinate systems and textures, and also has texture transform nodes, which Redshift hasn't implemented yet. Harry's tutorial inside of Unity is all in code, but the fundamentals of it are matrix multiplication, nodes that Redshift also does not have. Our eyes, or a camera in 3D, see depth as a change in speed per pixel of things that are going on. Parallax mapping is a technique that, instead of moving the camera position to imply depth, it moves the texture coordinates itself alongside a camera movement to imply depth. To get started, I've already set up a simple scene with a plane and a cube, and I've thrown a default material on it. I've just got this texture from the internet, which has got a grid on it. That'll be easy to see what we're doing. And I've set up external scale and rotation constants in there as a jump start for later. To start, we need to get the vector of a position in space to the camera. That way we can offset the texture by that much. Luckily, Redshift state nodes have a view direction output, which is exactly that. You might think that you could just pipe this directly into the texture offset and be done. And technically you'd be correct. It does offset the texture and look a little bit like a parallax effect, but there's a ton of distortion there, as you can see, and it's really hard to control. So the majority of this tutorial is going to be making systems that allow us to control this effect in a way that is a little bit more user-friendly. Get some space in our viewport and make a couple constants to be our controllers. The first is going to be our height, and it's just going to be a normal real, and the second is going to be our parallax, and that's what we're going to be working with. We want to set this to 1 just for the default value, and for now let's start with a value of like -0.1 as an offset. It'll make sense in a minute. We want to take our parallax and height values, and instead of going from 0 to 1, we want to shift that down and have it be centered over 0. So instead of 0 to 1, we want negative half height to positive half height. You could do this with a change range node, but it's faster to just use a couple of math nodes like the multiply node, the divide node, and the subtract node to get the same thing at a little bit of speed. Goddamn, Zeno, go away. So we're just going to pipe all these in. We're going to multiply the height by the parallax to get our upper range. We're going to divide parallax by 2 to get our lower range, and then we're going to subtract one from the other. And we can then multiply this to get a decent looking offset that we can control. So let's take a look at the front of this cube, and it looks like there's some offset there. You can kind of see it on the edges. If I crank up parallax to like -1, you can see that it's in space and we have a little bit more control over it. It's kind of hard to see what we're going on, and it'd be better to see a comparison between what the texture looked like before and what the texture looks like now. So let's set that up really quick. Under the color nodes, there's color composite, and so we'll composite just a basic layer of our texture along with the offset coordinates, and we'll add these together so we can see what's going on. Move these nodes over a little bit. So this is the base material, and this is the offset coordinates, and together they look like this. You can see that it looks like it's offset in space, and it's working out great. You can push it in and out, especially looking at this cube. If we set it to -1 again, it's back in space, it's back inside the cube, and if we move around, it looks perfect. But you've probably noticed already that not everything looks perfect, especially this floor. There's a lot of weird stuff happening with this floor, and even the top of the cube looks wrong. It looks like things aren't happening the way they should. This should probably not be in that position. And that's because the state node ray direction doesn't give us the vectors we need necessarily in the way we need them. When you see things moving, but not necessarily in the way that you need them to move, it means that some of the vector components are inverted. So to get around that, we're going to kind of hack our own vectors together. If I split these vectors out and then bring them back in, we can see this much easier. Now that these are all connected up, we can take a look at what I'm talking about. I happen to know from experimentation that if we're looking down from above, things break unless you swap the Y and Z components. So you can see that this lower texture is definitely beneath the surface. I also happen to know that if you swap the X and Z components, elements along the X-axis have proper parallax. This is one of the limitations of this cheat. It only really works on orthogonal directions. Another issue you've probably noticed already is that changing one of the coordinate systems messes up the coordinate systems for the other faces. Luckily, there's just a node that lets you assign coordinate systems in orthogonal directions, and that's the triplanar node. So now I'm going to split out our ray direction into X, Y, and Z components and then bring them back together using the triplanar node to have each face have the proper coordinate system. In the X direction, you want to swap X and Z. In the Y direction, you want to swap Y and Z. And for the Z direction, X, Y, and Z, they're all good. You just got to keep them as normal. To bring them into the triplanar node, it's very important to make sure that the same image on each axis is unchecked. If you don't do that, even if you open up image X, image Y, and image Z and pipe these into them, it will still duplicate X to all directions. You can now see that we've got proper parallax on X, proper parallax on, this is X, proper parallax on X, proper parallax on Z, and proper parallax on Y. Let's lower the parallax a little bit, -0.2, so you can get a little bit of better idea on that. It even works on the floor. When you get really close to something, this effect breaks. And that is another limitation of this cheat at the end of the day. It's all a cheat, so use this technique wisely and know the limitations of it. But the main things to keep in mind are don't get too close to it, or it can distort too much. Don't have super high angles that you're trying to take a look at. And also keep an eye on your edges, because the edges will come and go depending on your view direction. If all you wanted is just the basic technique breakdown of what's going on here, you've got it. This allows you to put textures inside and outside of materials as a fake texture offset at depth, or at, what's the opposite of depth? Forward depth, whatever. You get what I'm saying. But I want to take this a step further. I want to have this inside feel like it's properly inside. First, I'm going to pipe in base texture into the bump, so we have a little bit of a clearer idea of what the actual outside surface is. Now we have an idea of the surface of our material a little bit better and how our offsetted texture is inside the cube. If this were a real material, you wouldn't be able to see inside the cube perfectly. Depth has decay to it. So let's integrate that into our material. Because the way I'm combining these is the additive mode, a decay would be introducing more black into the equation. To do that, I'm going to introduce a color mix node, and while I'm here, I'm going to make a color constant, which is our color of black, and we'll pipe that into the input 2, and we will have our concrete floor interior piped into input 1. The mix amount gives a fall off to the depth inside. Let me organize this a little bit better. But JC, you're saying that cool ice crack technique looks like it actually had depth. It wasn't just a copy texture over and over again. And that's where I'd say you're wrong. That example was created by duplicating this rig over and over and over again at a very small offset to give the illusion of depth. And we can do that here too. I've been setting it up so that all of these nodes can be easily copy and pasted, hooked up, and then brought back into the fold to make even more layers of depth. But to do that, we need to make a few more external controls. The first is we're going to want to have this parallax be incremented over time. For each level of offset, we're just going to add itself over again. We're going to use an add node to do that. I'm also going to collapse nodes that don't have any inputs to them that we'll have to hook up again later to make the shader graph a little bit more legible. Now it should be clear why I popped out scale and rotation at the beginning. We're also going to want to increment color mix, so that way each subsequent layer of the parallax feels deeper and deeper into the thing. To do that, we're going to add another constant, and Sino is going to pop up again. We're going to label this decay. For right now, I'm just going to give it a 0.3, because that's, I think, how far we'll go in this tutorial. And to have that mix amount be incremented every time, we're going to use another add node and add every layer. Finally, I'm just going to make a copy of this composite node because it'll be helpful later. Select them all and copy them. I'm holding Control to duplicate all these nodes. Let's hook everything up. First, we're going to have our parallax add on to itself. So we're going to take the output of one parallax and put it into the input of another. So this should be doubling our parallax. We need to hook up our height controls, and we need to hook up our triplanar coordinate system. Afterwards, we need to increment our decay strength again, and also our color constant. Finally, we're going to open up the color composite our new layer onto our old layer, and then hook that up to the chain. You can repeat this step as many times for as much depth resolution as you'd like. I'm going to speed through a little bit more of me putting this together so you can see a final result. Here are a couple gotchas that you might run into. Using this system, the decay should be just less than 1 minus the number of textures you're using. In this case, I've got 5 textures, and so the decay should be 1 divided by the number of textures, 5 minus 1, which is 4. But you'll see that if I do 0.25, that I'm only really seeing 3 of those interior textures, and that's because the last one in the decay chain is actually fully black. So if you want to set that just beneath that, the final one will show up. Like I said at the beginning, this technique comes with a lot of drawbacks because at the end of the day, it's a cheat. One of those drawbacks is it's very dependent on your UVs of your mesh and the orientation of it in space. If you swap anything around, the offset will be also offset. So now it looks like that this texture is coming out of the thing instead of coming in. Another issue is that it is very dependent on the orthogonal views. If you rotate your mesh around, your offsets will not scale accordingly. Another gotcha is that your decay color depends greatly upon whatever you're using to composite your layers together. In this case, I'm using add, so my decay color is black so that it decays into nothingness. But if we're using an inverted texture, we would want to use the multiply composite mode and have this color be white. Similarly, if you're using overlay, you want that to be gray. Use whatever color fits your textures. Hopefully with the introduction of OSL or other additional nodes like matrix multiplications or a better view direction node or a better UV transform node or being able to input texture coordinates into textures or nodes within Redshift itself, we can fix some of these issues. This effect also works with UV tiling. So if I just set this to 3.3, not only does it work on the floor and it looks pretty sweet, it's also working on the cube. You can see that if I line up the center almost perfectly, the textures on the right are going inwards and the textures on the left are going inwards in different directions. One cool thing you could use instead of just repeating the same texture over and over again would be to use slightly different textures or slightly offset noises to give a true changing volumetric effect as opposed to just having one texture repeated in one direction. That's it for this technique. I hope you found it interesting, and if you make anything with this, I want to see it. I'm at JC Tecklenburg on Twitter and Instagram. You'll find me. Bye.